The comfort crisis. How modern life is engineering our misery in the 1st century. The Greek philosopher and orator Chrysostom wrote with startling foresight about a danger that would come to define our modern age. He observed that luxury possesses a deeply paradoxical power over the human spirit. It not only makes genuine pains seem even harder to bear, but it also dulls and weakens our capacity for pleasure. The person who is always luxuriating, he warned, and never touches pain will ultimately become unable to endure any pain at all. More tragically, they will also become unable to feel any true pleasure, not even the most intense. These ancient words echo with an eerie relevance today. We, in the modern Western world, are living through an unprecedented era of abundance and ease. We have access to comforts, conveniences, and entertainments which the most powerful kings of old could not have possibly dreamed of. At the touch of a button, we can summon a feast from any corner of the globe to our doorstep. We carry in our pockets devices that grant us access to the entirety of human knowledge. We live and work in perfectly climate-controlled environments, shielded from the planet's natural rhythms of heat and cold. We have, in essence, systematically engineered physical discomfort out of our daily existence. Yet, a profound and troubling paradox lies at the very heart of our comfortable modern lives. With all this unimaginable luxury, with all this incredible ease, we are demonstrably not happier. In fact, a growing body of evidence suggests that we are becoming more fragile, more anxious, and more prone to despair than ever before in human history. Rates of chronic stress, anxiety disorders, and clinical depression are at an all-time high across the developed world. We find ourselves physically comfortable but mentally and spiritually tormented. This debilitating phenomenon is what the journalist and author Michael Easter has aptly termed the comfort crisis. He argues that in our noble quest to make life easier, we have insulated ourselves from the very physical struggles, defined human existence for nearly its entire history. In doing so, we have inadvertently created a new and insidious set of psychological and physiological problems. We have developed too many ways to numb ourselves and escape from the slightest hint of discomfort. We turn to comfort food, alcohol, pills, and the endless, mindless scroll of our smartphones. We no longer have to deal with the acute, meaningful discomforts of working for our food, of moving our bodies for survival, or of enduring the raw, untamed power of the elements. Instead, we now face the chronic, soul-crushing side effects of our pervasive comfort, long-term physical and mental health problems that our ancient ancestors never knew. To truly grasp just how radical and evolutionarily novel our modern comfort is, we must contrast it with the stark reality our hunter-gatherer ancestors faced for over 99% of human history. Their lives were a constant testament to demanding, necessary physical activity. On a near-daily basis, they would have to walk 4 miles simply to find clean water and forage for edible plants, nuts, and berries. They expended enormous amounts of metabolic energy hunting large mammals, often engaging in the grueling practice of persistence hunting. This technique involved tracking and chasing fleet-footed prey for hours, sometimes across dozens of miles under a blazing sun, until the animal collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Once they finally made a kill, their arduous work was far from over. They would then have to butcher the massive animal and carry heavy pieces of raw meat back to their camp. Again, trekking over many miles of difficult terrain. As Michael Easter vividly writes in his book, before the advent of agriculture, we were essentially professional athletes whose livelihood required us to be physically active. Our ancestors did not need to work out in a gym for an hour a day. Their entire waking life was a continuous, varied, and functional workout. Alongside this intense physical exertion, our ancestors endured immense mental stress without the comforting panaceas that we now take for granted. They faced the constant, visceral threat of predators lurking in the shadows. They lived with the gnawing uncertainty of their next meal, and they bore the harsh elements of nature without the buffer of modern housing, air conditioning, or central heating. They dealt with sickness and infections without any access to the miracles of modern medicine. Precisely because their lives were so difficult, so uncomfortable, and so often painful, they evolved a powerful, instinctual drive to seek out and take full advantage of any available comfort or pleasure. This deeply ingrained drive was not a sign of weakness. It was a critical and non-negotiable survival mechanism. Whenever possible, they would rest and relax, allowing their minds and bodies to recover from the brutalities of their existence. When rich, calorie-dense food sources like fatty meat, ripe fruit, or honey were found, They would indulge themselves voraciously to build up vital energy reserves for the lean times ahead. In a world fundamentally defined by scarcity and hardship, this relentless, comfort-seeking drive was what helped them stay alive. The core of our modern problem is this. While we have inherited this exact same insatiable drive for pleasure and comfort, the world we inhabit has changed beyond all recognition. Our ancient evolutionary wiring, meticulously designed for an environment of scarcity, is now operating in a world of overwhelming, unprecedented abundance. The modern comforts and conveniences that define our daily life, computers, smartphones, climate control, ultra-processed food have been a part of the human experience for less than 0.03% of our species' time on Earth. Pervasive comfort is a radically new experiment for the human animal, and the initial results are proving to be deeply troubling. While very few of us would genuinely wish to return to the harsh conditions of our ancestral past, our modern world presents us with a new, insidious challenge. Our powerful drive for comfort did not evolve with a built-in obstacle. It is practically limitless. In the past, this was not a problem, as opportunities for comfort were rare and fleeting. But today, as the addiction specialist Dr. Tom Finnecane so famously and aptly put it, we are cacti in the rainforest. We are creatures biologically built for scarcity, and we are drowning in a world of endless, effortless. One of the most dangerous and subtle consequences of this profound mismatch is what Michael Easter calls comfort creep. This is the unconscious process by which we adapt to new comforts, which in turn causes our old comforts to feel like unacceptable discomforts. Today's unimaginable luxury quickly becomes tomorrow's non-negotiable necessity. The neuroscience of unhappiness, dopamine, gremlins, and the pain of pleasure to truly understand why our world of unprecedented comfort is failing so spectacularly to deliver on its implicit promise of happiness. We must venture into the inner cosmos of the human brain. We need to explore the intricate, delicate, and often deeply paradoxical relationship between pleasure and pain. In her groundbreaking and essential book, Dopamine Nation, Dr. Anna Lembke, a psychiatrist and the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic, brilliantly explains one of the most remarkable neuroscientific findings of the last century. She reveals that pleasure and pain are processed in overlapping regions of the brain and operate through a delicate, opponent process mechanism. The simplest and most effective way to understand this is to imagine a classic balance scale inside your brain. When you experience something pleasurable, such as eating a delicious piece of chocolate cake or receiving a notification on social media, the neurotransmitter dopamine is released in your brain's reward pathway, and the scale tips decisively to the side of pleasure. Conversely, when you experience something painful, like touching a hot stove or facing a harsh criticism, the scale tips just as decisively to the side of pain. The single most fundamental rule of this internal balance is that it always seeks to return to a state of equilibrium, a level state which scientists refer to as homeostasis. Your brain, for its long-term survival and stability, does not want the scale to be tipped too far to one side for too long. To achieve this crucial balance, it employs a powerful and automatic self-regulating mechanism. Whenever the balance is tipped strongly to the side of pleasure, the brain responds by tipping it an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. Dr. Lembke offers a vivid and helpful metaphor for this complex process. Imagine little representing your brain's homeostatic response, hopping on the pain side of the balance to counteract the weight of pleasure. So, after the initial enjoyable rush from that piece of chocolate cake, these metaphorical gremlins get to work, and you might feel a subtle, fleeting and almost unnoticeable sense of craving or emptiness as the balance swings back to level and then slightly past it. This is the simple, elegant, and evolutionarily ancient mechanism that ensures we do not get stuck chasing pleasure forever, and that we remain properly motivated to pursue the actual necessities of survival. This intimate, oppositional, and deeply intertwined relationship between pleasure and pain, intuited by brilliant philosophers long before the advent of modern neuroscience. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, in his book The Gay Science, posed a question that cuts directly to the heart of this matter. He asked, what? The ultimate goal of science is to create the most pleasure possible to man, and the least possible pain. But what if pleasure and pain should be so closely connected that he who wants the greatest possible amount of the one must also have the greatest possible amount of the other? Nietzsche profoundly understood that the passionate pursuit of heavenly highs often leads directly to the experience of crushing, sorrowful low. This is precisely where the problem begins in our modern world of dopamine and intensely potent pleasures. When we habitually and repeatedly indulge in the same pleasurable activities, our brain, being the incredibly adaptive organ that it is, begins to make adjustments through a process known as the same piece of cake, the same level in a video game, the same social media app no longer provides the same amount of pleasure it once did. Why does this happen? It happens because our brain has gotten wise to our attempts to artificially keep the scale tipped to the pleasure side. The next time we indulge, those little gremlins on the pain side of the balance have learned from experience. They have become quicker, stronger, and more numerous. They hop on the scale faster and in greater numbers, effectively diminishing the pleasure we feel while simultaneously strengthening the painful after. Not only do we now require more of a substance or stimulus to feel the same amount of pleasure, but the pain we experience following that pleasure, the craving, the anxiety, the restlessness, the emptiness becomes significantly more severe and lasts for a much longer period of time. If we continue down this path of intemperance, we eventually reach a terrifying and debilitating state. Chronic overindulgence in unhealthy food, pornography, video games, alcohol, drugs, or social media can tip the scales to the side of pleasure for so long and to such an extreme degree that our brain's pleasure-pain balance no longer returns to a level state. It fundamentally resets its baseline, its natural set point, to the side of pain. When this occurs, our drug of choice no longer gives us any real, discernible pleasure. We are no longer consuming it to feel good. We are now consuming it just to feel normal, to get a few moments of temporary relief from a chronic, underlying state of pain, anxiety, and profound dissatisfaction. This, in essence, is the clinical definition of addiction, as Dr. Lembke so powerfully explains. The paradox is that hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake, leads to anhedonia, which is the inability to enjoy pleasure of any kind, the relentless pursuit of pleasure, and the corresponding, frantic avoidance of all pain. Ironically and tragically, leads to a life filled with chronic low-grade and seemingly inescapable pain. The good news, however, is that this debilitating condition is reversible. We can, with conscious effort, reset our brain's besieged reward pathway through a dedicated period of abstinence. Dr. Lembke notes from her extensive clinical experience that a period of approximately 4 weeks of abstaining from our specific drugs of choice is often sufficient to achieve this reset. This practice, sometimes referred to as a dopamine fast, allows the overworked gremlins on the pain side of the balance to finally hop off, letting our brain's natural set point gradually return to a healthy, level equilibrium. After such a period of abstinence, we can regain the capacity to enjoy the simple, natural pleasures of life: a quiet walk in nature, a meaningful conversation with a friend, a healthy home-cooked meal. These are pleasures that do not tip the scales so violently that they create a painful and destabilizing aftershock. To aid us in this challenging but essential quest for abstinence, we can utilize what Lembke calls techniques of self. This involves intentionally and willingly creating physical and digital barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice in order to mitigate compulsive overconsumption. The antidote of discomfort, forging resilience through voluntary hardship. This brings us to the final and most crucial part of our journey, the solution, an antidote as ancient as humanity itself. We have diagnosed the core problem of our age. Our comfortable, pleasure-saturated modern world is in a direct and damaging clash with our ancient brain wiring, leading to a state of chronic dissatisfaction, anxiety, and profound fragility. We have also explored the specific neurological mechanism behind this paradox, understanding how the relentless pursuit of easy pleasure ironically and inevitably leads to an enduring state of pain. This leads us to the final and most crucial part of our journey. The solution. If too much manufactured comfort is the poison that ails us, then the antidote, as paradoxical as it may sound, is a conscious and intentional dose of meaningful discomfort. To truly rebalance the scales of pleasure and pain in our favor, we must be willing to voluntarily and strategically seek out healthy forms of pain, effort, and hardship. This seemingly counterintuitive idea is the logical and necessary conclusion of the neuroscience Dr. Lembke so clearly describes. Just as the pursuit of too much pleasure ends in a chronic state of pain, voluntarily partaking in healthy activities that involve temporary pain or strenuous effort tips our pleasure-pain balance toward a more enduring and sustainable experience of pleasure. When we intentionally engage in difficult activities, those metaphorical gremlins in our brain are forced to work in the opposite direction. They must hop on the pleasure side of the balance to counteract the weight of the pain we are experiencing. With consistent, intermittent exposure to healthy forms of pain, our natural hedonic set point actually gets weighted to the side of pleasure over the long term. This powerful adaptation makes us less vulnerable to unexpected pain and, crucially, more able to feel genuine pleasure from the simple, everyday experiences that our overstimulated brains had previously learned to ignore. The most obvious and accessible example of a healthy activity that exposes us to pain is, of course, physical exercise. The temporary, burning pain of pushing our muscles to their limits, the discomfort in our lungs as we gasp for air. This healthy stress triggers a powerful homeostatic response from our brains. Countless studies have shown that the positive mood and flood of endorphins that follow the temporary pain of physical exercise not only make us feel good for hours afterward, but also actively reduce our cravings for unhealthy high dopamine pleasures. Dr. Lembke notes that high levels of physical activity in adolescence and early adulthood are strong predictors of lower levels of drug and alcohol use later in life. Furthermore, exercise has been repeatedly shown to be an incredibly effective tool for those who are already struggling with various forms of addiction. Beyond the realm of traditional exercise, other forms of controlled physical discomfort can have similarly powerful and beneficial effects on our minds and bodies. For instance, a wealth of recent research has validated the ancient practice of cold water immersion. Studies now show that immersing oneself in cold water, even for just a few minutes, triggers a massive and prolonged release of dopamine and other mood-enhancing neurotransmitters, with effects that can last for hours after exiting the water. Similarly, exposing oneself to intense heat in a sauna has been shown to have profound benefits for both cardiovascular and mental health. These ancient practices work because they are a form of hormesis beneficial, low-dose stressor that forces our bodies and minds to adapt. Think of it as a vaccination for adversity. A small, controlled dose of a stressor strengthens the entire system against future, larger shocks. By adapting to these intentional hardships, we become stronger, tougher, and more resilient to future challenges. However, the practice of voluntary discomfort is not, and should not be, limited to the physical realm. We can, and should, also seek out challenges that involve mental, emotional, and psychological stress. The very act of setting lofty, ambitious goals and struggling each day to achieve them, or seeking out hard intellectual problems that require intense focus and creative thinking, can temporarily tip our internal scales towards pain in a way that ultimately leads to a profound sense of satisfaction, accomplishment, and purpose. This is the deep pleasure that follows meaningful and difficult effort. The entrepreneur who risks failure to build a new venture, or the artist who confronts the terror of the blank canvas, are both engaging in this noble form of struggle, having a difficult but necessary conversation with a loved one facing a long-held fear of public speaking, or dedicating oneself to learning a new and challenging skill. All of these activities involve consciously stepping out of our comfort zone and embracing discomfort for the sake of long-term growth. And this radical philosophy of intentionally seeking out hardship in order to achieve a greater good has deep historical roots, most famously with the ancient Greek cynics. The 4th century BC philosopher Diogenes was such a firm believer in this principle that he dedicated his entire life to its practice. He was, in many ways, a man far, far ahead of his time, a neuroscientist of the soul to millennia before the term existed. Diogenes spent his days actively looking for ways to make himself uncomfortable. He would roll over hot sand in the summer and walk barefoot in the snow, even embracing ice-covered statues in the winter. He famously rejected all material possessions, choosing to live in a large clay storage jar. He intentionally evoked the ridicule and scorn of others in order to train himself to be completely indifferent to social opinion. He was conducting a lifelong experiment to prove that human happiness is sourced internally, completely independent of external fortune. He lived on the simplest of foods, and sometimes practiced what we today call intermittent fasting. Many of his contemporaries, and indeed many throughout history, have labeled Diogenes a madman for his extreme lifestyle. But he claimed that by despising conventional pleasure, he was able to experience the greatest of pleasures. He argued that by voluntarily seeking out discomfort, he was able to enjoy his simple life in a tub far more than the great Persian king could ever enjoy his luxurious palace. Given what we now understand about the intimate, oppositional connection between pleasure and pain, it is clear that Diogenes was not mad. He was practicing a radical form of mental and physical self-mastery, hacking his own brain's reward system to millennia, before the term existed. He simply understood the central paradox of human happiness. In our modern world of abundance, where an unbridled pursuit of pleasure and comfort is crippling our minds, weakening our bodies, and making us highly susceptible to pain, we would be wise to follow his example. This does not mean we must live in a clay jar, but it does mean we should intentionally make our lives a little more difficult, a little more uncomfortable, and a little more painful. We can choose to take the stairs instead of the elevator. We can take a cold shower in the morning. We can turn off our phones and endure the discomfort of boredom. We can challenge ourselves to learn something difficult. By embracing these small, voluntary hardships, we can, paradoxically, maximize our strength, our resilience, our pleasure, and our joy. As Nietzsche once put it, what we need today is a bit of cynicism, a little bit of the tub. We must learn to welcome pain as inevitable, to grasp the serpent by the neck, and to understand that meaningful labor is the true source of enduring pleasure. For in the barren soil of what we avoid, true strength, and therefore true pleasure, finds its deepest roots.